delighted over the years to work with the Hindu American Foundation, to work with HAF on a number of initiatives, and it's really a great honor. In the Hindu tradition, we have something called seva, service, and we've seen a number of people tonight already who really exemplify that. And this is really the great ideal that HAF embodies in many ways, serving not only the Hindu community to promote a better understanding, better awareness of Hindu traditions, and dispelling myths, dispelling exoticism, and so forth, but also doing a service to really the entire community, because the Hindu tradition is a great treasure. It is full of wonderful ideas, full of wonderful practices, thoughts that can benefit everyone. And in fact, that brings us to my topic today of Hindu themes in Star Wars. And you might think that sounds rather odd, right? Hinduism and Star Wars. And I know there's some people here tonight who are probably not very familiar with Hinduism, and I think there might even be some people here tonight who are not very familiar with Star Wars. But you're going to learn about both today, and that there are, in fact, some very interesting connections between these two. This is a very small part of a much larger scholarly project that I'm involved in right now, which is looking at the ways in which Hindu ideas, Hindu thought, Hindu practice has been transmitted into the Western world, very often by Hindus who come and made America their home, thankfully, but also through other sources. There have been Hindu teachers who've inspired intellectuals, artists, many creative people, going back almost 200 years, almost to the founding of the United States. And through those people, Hindu ideas have come to so infuse American culture that a lot of Americans are really kind of Hindu without even knowing it. And in fact, a few years ago, Lisa Miller from Newsweek wrote a piece with the rather controversial title, "We're All Hindus Now," talking about how certain Hindu ideas have really become mainstream in America. And one of the avenues of this transmission of Hindu thought has been Star Wars. So that's what I'm going to talk about with you today. Star Wars and Vedanta. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Vedanta is really the core philosophy of many forms of Hinduism. It was first brought to America by a Hindu monk, Swami Vivekananda, in 1893. He established something called the Vedanta Society. I'm a member of that. That's my particular tradition. And he brought these ideas into America and really did a lot to get this process started. So what's the connection between Star Wars and Vedanta? Well, Star Wars we could call a modern-day epic myth. One thing I want to say about the word myth is problematic if we apply it to Hindu texts and traditions. But when we talk about myth as scholars, we're talking about a story that may or may not have happened in actuality, but its main point is the ideas that it communicates. And George Lucas really deliberately set out to create a myth for America. He wanted to create a great American myth through his films, and Star Wars was the result. And I want to point out that this highly successful modern-day myth is mainly intended for fun. I've underlined the word fun. In other words, I am not here today to claim that George Lucas deliberately set out to communicate Hindu ideas to the world through Star Wars. That's not my thesis. And last night I gave this presentation at another HA event in Sacramento and talked with a lot of people afterward. The Matrix films came up, and it's another very popular set of movies that some of you might be familiar with. The Wachowski brothers, who developed the Matrix films, wrote and directed them, really did intend to communicate Hindu ideas and some ideas shared by Hindu and Buddhist traditions through those films. And you can see it very, very clearly if you look at those films. Star Wars, much more popular, much more influential, was not deliberately crafted in this way. I think it happened more or less by accident, or we would say good karma in Hindu tradition. And I want to trace that process for you a little bit. George Lucas was once asked by a reporter about the deep philosophical inner meaning of his films. And he sort of looked befuddled and said, you know, these films are made for 12-year-olds, right? He did not want to claim that he was trying to make a grand philosophical statement. He was trying to tell a story and trying to create an epic myth for America, just as other countries like India have their great national stories. So while it's true that Lucas was really just trying to tell a story and do something that would be a lot of fun for all of us, it is nevertheless possible to discern numerous Vedantic themes, images, and even names in the Star Wars universe. You're all going to learn a little bit of Sanskrit tonight. I hope you don't mind. But I teach Sanskrit too, so I can't help but bring it in a little bit. So who is George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars? Well, of course, a world-famous director who, growing up in the America of the 50s and coming of age in the 60s, was drawn to filmmaking at an early age. In a very creative mind, he wanted to make movies. And the Star Wars films were not the first films, in fact, that he made. But Star Wars was always sort of his pet project. After reading Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he conceived a desire to create a great American epic myth on film. I'm going to say more about that and about Joseph Campbell in a moment. His inspirations, you could say the ingredients that went into the DNA of Star Wars, were many. Westerns, right? There's a great American myth right there. You know, you've got the good guy, you've got the bad guy, you've got the gunfight. This is all something that's very deeply woven into American culture. World War II films. If you think about all those fights in Star Wars between TIE fighters and X-Wing fighters and Star Destroyers and the Millennium Falcon and so on, this is all inspired by these old films showing American pilots engaging in what were called dogfights with Japanese and German fighters during World War II. And so those old films really played a big role in the look and feel of Star Wars. Early science fiction serials like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. These are great. If you can dig these up, if you can find these and watch them, they're a lot of fun to watch. The effects aren't too good, but you know the heart is there. And just as someone like myself, you know, I saw the first Star Wars film when I was 8 years old. I grew up on Star Wars in the same way Lucas grew up on these serials, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. And then we have samurai films, the films of the great director Akira Kurosawa, who was a very strong influence on George Lucas, stronger than many people realize. And his one film in particular called The Hidden Fortress is a direct inspiration of Star Wars. If you watch The Hidden Fortress back to back with the original Star Wars film, you'll see it's basically the same plot. The Hidden Fortress is set in medieval Japan. The Star Wars film is, of course, set in another galaxy far, far away, but basically the same heroes, the same heroine, the same storyline is running through it all. And, of course, Joseph Campbell. We need to talk about Joseph Campbell because he's really the link between George Lucas and Hinduism. So who was Joseph Campbell? He lived from 1904 to 1987, and he was a great scholar. He popularized the comparative study of religion and world mythologies. He was the author of The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the book that inspired Lucas, and with journalist Bill Moyers of a book called The Power of Myth. The Power of Myth is a wonderful book. There's a whole chapter in there on Star Wars, in fact. It's a transcription of interviews that Moyers did with Campbell, and these were aired on PBS back in the 1980s. And I was watching them as a teenager and very inspired by Campbell, listening to him talk about these wonderful stories, different belief systems, different worldviews. And I thought that would be a really neat job. So that was one of my inspirations for going into this field. It looks like I'm wearing the same jacket too. That was not by design. It just sort of unconscious influence, right? So The Hero with a Thousand Faces was the direct inspiration for George Lucas' attempt to create an American mythology in the form of Star Wars. The Hero with a Thousand Faces puts forth the idea that Campbell develops. He's really taking from his own mentor, Carl Jung, the idea of archetypes, that there are characters, there are narrative devices that appear in the great stories of world literature again and again and again. And these recurring themes, these recurring motifs, are believed to be really a clue to the nature of human consciousness because they appear again and again in cultures often widely separate from one another. And so Lucas was inspired by that, and he wanted to follow the pattern of the hero's journey laid out by Campbell in his mythological story. Campbell was also an earnest student of Vedanta, of Hindu philosophy, and assisted Swami Nityananda with the translation of the Bengali text, the Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita,
which was translated by Nikhilananda as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Nikhilananda was a Hindu monk in the Ramakrishna order, the order of monks founded by Swami Vivekananda, the monk I mentioned earlier, who first brought Hinduism to America. Vivekananda's teacher, Ramakrishna, is the one for whom the order is named, and this book, The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, is a first-hand account of his teachings over the course of the last few years of his life. It was written in the Bengali language, and Swami Nikhilananda undertook the task of translating it. And Joseph Campbell didn't know Bengali, but he helped Swami Nikhilananda put some of the phrasing into elegant English that flowed. And the book is really a classic of world spirituality. Pravajika Vrajaprana, who is both a scholar and a nun in the Ramakrishna order, says no reader of Joseph Campbell can escape Sri Ramakrishna, that Joseph Campbell was so thoroughly influenced by Ramakrishna, by Vedanta, by his work with Swami Nikhilananda, that it infuses really all of his work. And that's true. If you know what to look for, you can see it. And here we have a photo of Lucas with Joseph Campbell. So if you want to, if anyone ever expresses skepticism about the extent of the interaction, or did Campbell and Lucas really know each other or meet, there they are, right? We've got the photograph, so we've got our evidence, right? As scholars, we need evidence. So this is the lineage, this is the story, right? Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Swami Nikhilananda, Joseph Campbell, George Lucas, right? In Hindu tradition, this is called the Guru Shishya Parampara, right? The tradition passing on from teacher to student. So, how does this all play out in Star Wars? Vedantic concepts in Star Wars. Well, probably the most Vedantic concept in Star Wars is the Force, which is a very central idea in Star Wars. It's almost a character in its own right in Star Wars. It's a very, very central part of all the films. In the original Star Wars film, Obi-Wan Kenobi defines it as an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together. This is analogous to the concept of Brahman that one finds in the Vedanta philosophy. Vedanta philosophy is based on the idea that there is one supreme universal reality that all things are part of, from which all things have emerged. And the aim of Vedanta as a practice and as a way of life is to realize and fully manifest this Brahman in our lives. This Brahman is the core of our own being. It is identical with the self, the Atman. And realizing that true self, not the ego self, but the self with a capital S, as modern-day Vedantins will put it, realizing this is really the ultimate aim of our existence. And this Force, as it's presented to us in Star Wars, is something that really helps us realize and manifest our highest potential. The people who use the Force, who tap into the Force in Star Wars, are called the Jedi Knights. And Obi-Wan Kenobi was one of these great Jedi Knights. The way the Jedi use the Force, you could say they don't use the Force, they let the Force use them. There's a saying, there's an expression you'll often hear in the Star Wars films when the Jedi are being trained: let the Force flow through you, right? You set aside your own ego, you set aside your thoughts, you calm the mind through a process of meditation, and you let the Force flow through you and guide you and your actions. There's another group of people called the Sith Lords, and they follow something called the dark side of the Force. And they use this power of the Force for evil. You could say that they do use the Force, right? They twist the Force to their own goals, their own ego-driven ends. Usually power is what the Sith want. Whereas the Jedi serve the Force, right? They do seva. They let the Force flow through them. Now, in Vedanta philosophy, there's no dark side of Brahman. Brahman is pure good. Brahman is called infinite being, consciousness, and bliss. It's joyful, it's loving, it's what unifies all things. But there is something else that we talk about in the Vedanta philosophy called Maya. That is, until we are fully realized, until we fully comprehend and grasp and manifest Brahman within our lives, we're subject to something called Maya, which is really kind of the way Brahman appears to us in the world. It's an effect of something called avidya, that is ignorance. Ignorance. Because of our ignorance of our own true nature, we seek for happiness outside ourselves. We seek it in power. We seek it in fame and glory and wealth and all of these other things. But all of this is really just a manifestation of Brahman. We really have all that we need within our own self. But we seek for happiness outside, and so we fall into this problem of suffering, this problem of unhappiness, which the Buddhist tradition also tells us about. This is due to attachment to temporary things that we think will make us happy, but the reality really is the Brahman within them. That's really the true source of bliss. So we're subject to the dark side, right? We're subject to ignorance, to Maya, to avidya, and because of that, we become selfish, we become evil, we become hateful. The Hindu tradition teaches no one is really truly evil. The core of all existence is infinite bliss, infinite goodness, but because of our ignorance of that, we fall into bad behaviors. So we become like the figure whose back is to us here in this picture, Darth Vader, right? The enemy, the main antagonist in the Star Wars films. In the second Star Wars movie, it's called Episode 5. I'll explain that in a little while. But it's called The Empire Strikes Back. Luke Skywalker, the main hero, the main protagonist, he studies under another teacher. First, he trains under Obi-Wan. Then Obi-Wan falls in combat to Darth Vader. Actually, he disappears. He becomes one with the Force. But in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke trains with Master Yoda. And Yoda is a very interesting figure. And in fact, he is a real embodiment of a lot of the Hindu ideals that we find in the Star Wars universe. He is Luke's guru. He is Luke's teacher. Where did this name Yoda come from? A lot of people think it sounds like yoga, but it's not yoga. It's from Yodha, which in Sanskrit means warrior. I told you I was going to teach you some Sanskrit today. So Yodha is from Yuddha, war. So Yodha, warrior. He teaches Luke the true nature of the Force. True mastery, again, comes not from seeking for power or trying to impose one's will on the world. That is the path to the dark side, as Yoda teaches. The Force flows when one's mind is calm and at peace, as in the state of meditation. The Jedi is the instrument of the Force, not the other way around. There's a climactic moment in The Empire Strikes Back that I want to draw our attention to. The two photos here, you see Yoda teaching his student Luke from this particular scene in The Empire Strikes Back. On the right, we have a scene from a sacred Hindu text called the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of the Lord. And we see on the left the character Arjuna. He's the hero of the Mahabharata, a great epic, many ways like Star Wars, but set in ancient India. And we see his friend and teacher Krishna in this scene. And Lord Krishna is a manifestation of the Supreme. He is the Supreme, right? And he is revealing his true nature here to Arjuna as the supreme embodiment of the infinite Brahman, the Lord. And there's a kind of an analogous scene here in The Empire Strikes Back where Yoda finally reveals to Luke the true extent of the power of the Force. Luke has been getting very frustrated because a Jedi is supposed to be able to do things like use the Force to lift rocks and move things around and that sort of thing. And he's having a hard time doing it. He's having a hard time disciplining his mind. He hasn't grown up with this habit of meditation. So Yoda instructs him. And he tells Luke that he's getting frustrated about his ability to lift things because he thinks that things are real. Because he thinks that there's a big difference between a small rock and a large spaceship. And Luke's spaceship has just sunk into the swamp, so that's not a very good situation to be in. Yoda tells Luke, the difference is only in your mind. Size is not real. Time, space, the material world, these are all just manifestations of consciousness. He says, luminous beings are we. And he reaches over and pinches Luke on the shoulder. He says, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Right? We are beings of pure consciousness, and when we fully comprehend and manifest that, then this whole world is seen as the play of consciousness and can be transformed in the way that the Jedi transform it. And then he proceeds to very gently extend his hand, close his eyes, and through the power of the Force, lift Luke's spaceship out of the swamp. And Luke says, I don't believe it. And Yoda says, that is why you fail. Because he's not really fully comprehended this idea of consciousness. When I saw this movie, The Empire Strikes Back came out in 1980, so I was 11. You can calculate my age if you want to. The age of this body, right? Soul was infinite, so it doesn't matter how old the body is. And when I was 11, shortly before that, my father was in a terrible accident, and it rendered him quadriplegic. And it was at this time that I began to realize that we are not this physical body. We identify with this physical body. But if the physical body can become your enemy and become your prison, then that is not you. You are that which is being imprisoned by it. This accident eventually led to his death a couple of years later. And this teaching of Yoda, when I saw this film, he says, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Something clicked in my mind. I said, yes, we aren't this body. My dad is not that prison that he is trapped in. And after my father had passed away, I actually came across a copy of the Bhagavad Gita and began learning the Hindu teaching, which is basically what Yoda was saying, right? This body is like clothing that we wear, right? We have to put on our clothes or we're not decent, right? We use that expression, right? So we have to put on a body so we can interact with this material world. And then after a while it wears out, doesn't work anymore, so we have to put it off and take on a new one. The Gita says the wise are not deluded by this, right? No need to fear death. So this was very deeply reassuring to me. As part of his training, Luke has to face the dark side. We can't overcome the darkness by pretending it's not there, by looking the other way. We have to face it. We have to confront it and overcome it. And he has to face it in the form of this enemy, Darth Vader. And at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, and if you're not familiar with Star Wars, I apologize. This is the biggest spoiler ever in cinematic history. But he discovers that Darth Vader, the evil enemy, is his father. His father that he thought had been killed long ago as a Jedi. Turns out that Darth Vader was his father and had turned to the dark side of the Force. His father in the third movie tries to draw Luke to the dark side, to become a servant of the character on the far right, the Emperor, who really is an embodiment of pure avidya, pure ignorance. His sole pursuit in life is power. He rules the whole galaxy. Does that make him happy? Not really, right? We just want more and more and more because we want the infinite, right? We want the infinite. So none of these finite things, even the rulership of the galaxy is not enough to fulfill us. He tries to pull Luke over to the dark side to anger him. And Darth Vader provokes Luke into fighting with him. And Luke almost kills him. And the Emperor starts cackling and he says, kill your father and take his place at my side. And at that moment, Luke's love for his father surfaces, and he sees the harm that he's about to do. And he throws away his lightsaber, and he says, never. I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I'm a Jedi like my father before me. I love that moment. Sometimes when I get this talk, I get choked up at that moment. I managed to avoid it today. But it's a very powerful mind, And this love Luke has for his father, the true essence of his father, not the evil thing he has become, that reaches out to Darth Vader. And Darth Vader, with his last strength, stands up and casts the Emperor into an abyss, which is sort of conveniently nearby. You always need a good abyss somewhere nearby, right? When you're facing ultimate evil. So, and Vader is redeemed. He returns to the light. Now, his name originally was Anakin Skywalker. How did he become Vader? This was always a very intriguing question to us Star Wars fans after we saw these first three films. And for many years, we didn't know the answer. But then George Lucas made another series of 3 films that tell us that earlier story of how Anakin Skywalker turned to the dark side and became Darth Vader. They call these the prequels, and they've gotten a mixed reception among fans over the years, but there's some real depth in them as well. And our Hindu themes continue, I think, even more strongly to some extent in the prequels. How did Anakin become Vader? Through something that we call attachment. In the Bhagavad Gita, we are taught that to become liberated, to become free from suffering and free from the cycle of death, that we have to practice something called vairagya, detachment. Detachment doesn't mean you're a cold, heartless person who doesn't care about others. That misperception comes from confusing attachment for love. So often we think that love and attachment are the same thing, but they're actually directly opposed. Even though they're often mixed up with one another in our consciousness, they are opposites. Love is the genuine recognition and appreciation of the divinity in another being. The knowledge that the universe is a better and richer place because you are in it, and not that it's doing anything for me, right? Attachment is all about me, right? I love you because you love me back. It makes me feel good. You're doing something for me. Attachment. So Anakin Skywalker, in the second prequel, in the first one we just meet him, he's a little boy. In the second one, his mother dies, and he is unable to save her. And he's filled with guilt, he's filled with remorse, he's filled with anger, and he determines that he's never going to let anyone that he loves die again. I'll ask you, especially the older folks in the audience who've experienced some loss, right? How realistic is that? I'm never going to let anyone die, right? I know there are a lot of doctors here, so, death is an inevitable part of life in this material world. So he thinks he's going to prevent the woman he loves. This is Padme, sounds like Padma, lotus in Sanskrit. He has a vision that she's going to die, and he wants to prevent her death. And the man who will become the emperor deludes him into thinking that if he turns to the dark side, he can save her life. She tries to turn him back to the light, and in a fit of anger, he uses the Force and actually harms her a great deal, and eventually leads to her death as she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Luke Skywalker. The last thing I want to mention, coming to the end of my presentation, but the story doesn't end just with the death of the Emperor and Darth Vader's redemption. That would be a very linear story of good defeating evil, like what we're familiar with in the West. According to the Hindu tradition, the realm of time and space is never perfect. Our aim is to become ultimately free from that. The more recent Star Wars films, like The Force Awakens, we see that the battle between the Empire and the Resistance just keeps going on and on and on and on through history. And in the last Star Wars film, The Last Jedi, we see Luke, who is now the guru, who is now the teacher, teaching the young Rey that the Force is not just a power that is outside of you that you could use, it is your very self, which is the essential teaching of Vedanta. So thank you all for your attention to this. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you support HAF, because this tradition, as you can see, is so rich. It infuses these very successful movies, and most people don't even know it. There's so much there to understand. And this group, this Hindu American Foundation, is really there to be the voice of this community and of this tradition in America. And no one else is doing this work. So please do give it your support. Thank you very much. And may the Force be with you.